The saloon doors swung open with their familiar creak, and every head in McGinty's turned to look. They always did when Marcus, the giant, Callahan walked in. At 6'8" and broad as a barn door, he couldn't help but command attention. But Marcus had learned long ago that being noticed and being seen were two entirely different things. He ducked under the doorframe and made his way to the bar, his boots heavy on the weathered floorboards. The usual crowd was there, ranch hands finishing their workday, a few travelers passing through, and the women who worked the rooms upstairs. Marcus ordered his whiskey and kept his eyes forward, though he could feel the familiar weight of stares on his back. "You hear about Birdie?" Old Pete wheezed from his corner table, addressing no one in particular but loud enough for everyone to hear. "They're saying she wore out another one. Third man this month couldn't keep up with her appetite." Laughter rippled through the room, cruel and knowing. Marcus had heard the talk before. Everyone in Silver Creek had. Birdie Sullivan, the woman they called the Beast in the Sack, behind her back and sometimes, when they were drunk enough, to her face. She'd come to town 2 years ago and taken work at McGinty's, and the rumors had started almost immediately. She was insatiable, they said. Wailed. More animal than woman between the sheets. Men bragged about betting her, then complained she'd left them exhausted, inadequate, unable to satisfy whatever unnatural hungers drove her. Marcus had never understood the cruelty of it. The way they used her and then mocked her for wanting what they'd offered. The way they made her hunger into something monstrous while their own was just considered natural. He'd seen Birdie around town, of course. She was hard to miss, not because she was loud or drew attention to herself, but because she moved through Silver Creek like a ghost, never quite looking at anyone, her shoulders curved inward as if she could make herself smaller. She had wild auburn hair that she tried to tame into a bun, and a face that might have been called pretty if it wasn't always so carefully blank. But it was her eyes that Marcus noticed most. They were green as spring grass, and they held a sadness so deep it made his chest ache. The next time Marcus saw her was 3 days later at the general store. She was examining a bolt of fabric, running her fingers over the material with a gentleness that seemed at odds with her reputation. He watched as Mrs. Henderson, the store owner's wife, deliberately moved away when Birdie approached the counter, her mouth pinched in disapproval. "I'll wait," Birdie said quietly, stepping back. Something in Marcus snapped. He moved forward, his large frame unintentionally making Mrs. Henderson jump. "I believe the lady was here first," he said, his voice a low rumble. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed, but she took Birdie's money for the fabric without another word. Birdie kept her eyes down, clutching her package, and hurried toward the door. Marcus followed her out. "Miss Sullivan," he called. She stopped but didn't turn around immediately. When she finally did, her expression was wary, defensive. "I don't need your pity, Mr. Callan." "Good," he said. "Because I wasn't offering any." That surprised her enough that something flickered in those green eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or confusion. "Then what do you want?" It was a fair question, and Marcus found he didn't have a simple answer. What did he want? To tell her she deserved better than the way this town treated her? That seemed presumptuous. To say he understood what it felt like to be reduced to one thing in people's eyes, to have them look at you and see only size or reputation instead of the person underneath. That seemed too revealing. I wanted to say that what I did back there wasn't about charity. It was about what's right. She studied him for a long moment, and Marcus had the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen for the first time in years. "They call you the giant," she said finally. "But you're not what people say you are you? Are you?" The question hung in the air between them. Birdie's expression softened almost imperceptibly, and the corner of her mouth lifted in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "No," she said quietly. "I don't suppose I am." After that, they began to talk. It started with polite nods when they passed on the street, then evolved into actual conversations. Marcus learned that Birdie had come to Silver Creek fleeing a marriage to a man who'd beaten her so badly she'd nearly died. She'd had nowhere else to go and no skills that would earn her a living wage, so she'd done what she had to do to survive. "I'm not ashamed of the work," she told him one evening as they sat on the bench outside the church, far enough from the main street that people wouldn't immediately notice them together. "But I'm not what they say either. Those men who talk about me being insatiable, being some kind of animal. Do you know what they really mean?
Marcus shook his head.
They mean I wanted it to mean something. That I wanted them to see me as a person, not just a body they paid for. I wanted connection, warmth, maybe even tenderness. I wanted to matter, even if just for those few minutes. Her voice cracked slightly. But that made me demanding. Needy. Too much. Better to make me into a monster than to admit they couldn't give me the one thing I was actually asking for. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, like a lock turning. He'd spent his whole life being the giant, being the big man who lifted things and broke up fights and took up space. People either feared him or they wanted to use his strength. But they never looked deeper. They never wondered what kind of man lived inside all that size. I see you, he said simply. Birdie turned to look at him, and there were tears on her cheeks. I see you too. They began meeting regularly after that, always in quiet places where the town's prying eyes couldn't find them. Marcus told her about his childhood, about being the enormous boy who scared other children without meaning to, about learning to make himself smaller in spirit because he could never be smaller in body. Birdie talked about her dreams. Not big dreams, just small ones.
A little house of her own.
A garden. Days spent doing something other than surviving.
I want to wake up and not feel afraid, she confessed one night.
I want to go to sleep and not wonder if this is all there is. It's not, Marcus told her. There's more. There has to be. He started to realize he was falling in love with her, this woman the town had labeled a beast. He loved her fierce survival instinct and her quiet dignity. He loved the way she really listened when he spoke, the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, the way she touched his hand so gently, as if she understood that his size didn't make him invulnerable. He loved that she saw the man inside the giant. But Marcus was terrified too. What if he disappointed her the way those other men had? What if he couldn't give her what she needed? One evening, as they sat by the creek outside town, Birdie rested her head on his shoulder. You're thinking too loud, she said. I can practically hear the wheels turning in that big head of yours. Birdie, He stopped, unsure how to continue. You're afraid, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Of what? Of not being enough.
Of being just another disappointment.
She lifted her head and looked at him with those green eyes that saw everything. Marcus, do you know why those men couldn't give me what I needed? It wasn't because I wanted too much. It was because they couldn't see me as human. They couldn't give me tenderness because they didn't think I deserved it. They couldn't make me feel valued because they didn't value me. She took both his large hands in her smaller ones. But you already give me everything I need. You listen. You see me. You treat me like I matter. That's what I was always hungry for. Not anything physical, but that feeling of being real to someone. You're real to me, Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. You're the most real thing in my life. Then stop worrying about being enough. You already are. They married quietly a month later, with only the circuit preacher and his wife as witnesses. The town talked, of course. They said the giant had been taken in by the beast. That he'd learn soon enough what kind of woman she really was. That it would end badly. But Marcus and Birdie built their life anyway. They bought a small plot of land outside town and built a house. Modest but sturdy, with a porch that caught the evening sun and enough space for the garden Birdie had always wanted. Marcus took work at the lumber mill, and Birdie started taking in sewing. They weren't rich, but they were happy in a way that neither of them had ever expected to be. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, they would sit on that porch and Birdie would rest against Marcus's broad chest, and they would talk about their days or simply exist together in comfortable silence. And Marcus would think about all the words people had used to define them. Giant, beast, too much, too big, and how none of those words mattered anymore. Because he'd found his heart inside the woman others had tried to reduce to something monstrous. And she'd found hers inside the man others had seen as nothing but size and strength. They'd looked past the reputations and the rumors and found two people who just wanted the same thing everyone wanted. To be seen, to be valued, to matter to someone. They called her the beast in the sack. They called him the giant. But in their little house with its garden and sun-drenched porch, they called each other by their real names, and that was all the identity either of them needed.